We're going to be taking a quick look at just some of the gaps the use of components can fill in a more traditional game development pipeline, especially those seen inside of Unreal. Due to the prominence and inheritance-based class structure inside of Unreal, you find that many projects end up relying heavily on inheritance and polymorphism in the project structure. And whilst there's nothing inherently wrong with this, there are some scenarios where it can become somewhat restrictive. So let's take a look at a really simple example, but something that can quickly get out of control if not accounted for early in the development pipeline. In this case, I'm considering a very simple game like an old 2D Zelda RPG, but I've picked this because it can also have some very kind of wide and flexible systems implemented. In this type of game, when traversing the world, the A button can usually be used to interact with a range of actors. For instance, we can walk up to a chest or item lying around on the floor, and you can press A and you'll be able to interact with the item and either open the chest or collect the item. We could also walk up to an NPC and engage in some dialogue with them if we press the same interact button, and in rare cases we may even encounter an enemy that doesn't dive straight into combat and interact with them in a similar way. All of this can also extend to set dressing like trees, rocks, and other points of interest. And if you have a system in your game which is flexible enough that's implemented in this way, this will allow you to very easily add kind of flavor text to the game to provide funny kind of quips when you're trying to interact with rocks or providing extra information about the type of shrub or tree that you're looking at and just how that fits into the world's lore. So let's take a look at what the inheritance approach might look like if we tried sticking perhaps with a somewhat too stringent use of utilizing inheritance and cutting down the code duplication. So we could have something like an interactive base class with our interact functionality defined. From this, we could split into more object-focused classes, which would make up the set dressing and pickup items. And then going down the other path, we could have our interactive pawn class, which would be the base for our players, NPCs, and enemies. Now, at the moment, this doesn't look too bad. It could definitely work, but it does look a little bit strange when we read back through our code and consider that a door and an NPC are both inheriting from the same custom parent. We can even end up with a less ideal scenario. I've actually come across projects that look somewhat like this, where reusability was a focus, but hadn't been fully considered early in the project. This can lead to situations where you might take a fairly common class, such as the pawn, implement your interactive function as you've only foresaw it being used on enemies and NPCs, and then later you realize that trees and chests are really doing the same thing. In this case, a tree could end up as an NPC with features such as dialogue trees, inventory, health, animation, and the like all stripped out, which can definitely be a little bit of a strange way to implement things. If we take a quick look, and this is going to be much more familiar hopefully, but a quick look at our class structures and how they might look in a project without these restrictions imposed. Our pawn structure would be much more refined, composed purely of the NPC and the enemy subclasses, and that could potentially have a boss subclass as well. And these would have the properties and functions specific to those types of actors in the game. Likewise, the objects can take their core features and be separated based on those things relevant to them, like being a static object that would consist of the set dressing, like trees and rocks, and then collectibles, such as the items and chests. Then with the use of components, we'd create a flexible interact component which we can then apply to the required classes, ideally the base pawn and the base object class, so that anything that derives from these can then support some type of interaction. And approaches like this allow for the potential for some emergent gameplay moments coming from a wide range of flexible systems all working together in sometimes fun and unexpected ways. So inside of our interact component, we could implement an onInteractStart and an onInteractEnd function to allow classes like the enemy class to launch into combat on InteractEnd, or collectibles to be removed and added to the inventory. Alternatively, things like a Boolean check, like a multi-interaction check, will allow the chest to only be opened that once and then never reused, whilst NPCs will be able to repeat their line of dialogue indefinitely. So this is a little bit of an abstract example for the use of components, but I wanted to demonstrate that they don't always need to be something to manage the type of something or the movement of an actor. or doing things like variable trackings in the health components and things like that. Now, these are all going to be examples that we will see and make use of in this course, and that's why I wanted to take this slightly larger, more abstract version of a component class and another way that it could be used. So now that we've seen some of the considerations to make when working with your components in the previous section and the benefits of using them in this module, we're primed and ready to take our first look at how to create our own custom components and begin adding them to an existing actor.